In 1895, the brakes on a train failed, causing it to crash through a 2-foot-thick wall at Gare Montparnasse in Paris, France. The engine careened across the train station concourse, blasting through a wall and landing on the street 1 story below in Place de Rennes. A woman standing outside and directly below the train was killed. She was helping her husband at his newspaper stand while he was away gathering newspapers to sell that evening. Good and bad things happen, and architecture provides a kind of theater, or more specifically, stage set. The architect designs the backdrop, and the actor cares mostly about how it works. Any good production is most enjoyed when watched beginning to end. That is, story matters. And the same is true for architecture. One could argue that it's most enjoyed in light of history. But what if this idea were unimportant or forgotten? And what if the very people that were both using or even creating the buildings that surround us knew very little of their beginning? What then? That is, how can we know what something could be if we never learned what came before it? And if everything is judged by what it looks like instead of how it got that way, we're missing half the story. The architect is special, partly because of his or her historical architectural education. When we understand who is responsible for something, what it was, where it came from, and why it existed, we possess valuable information to create, but even more so, to judge. The Greeks and Romans learned that proportion and scale were critical to pleasing design. Symmetry in architecture was pursued vigorously for centuries. Slowly, qualities like asymmetry and much later, pure function or unconventional form became commonplace. Today, architects test the limits of shape and material. At times, idea, theme, and message have become as important, or more so, than how a building works. These new ways of thinking challenge traditional ideas about aesthetics and beauty. In fact, a building might be considered successful simply by virtue of the fact that it is what it isn't. The history of architecture informs these judgments. It's not unusual that one person thinks a building is beautiful and another thinks the opposite. Beauty is a mercurial subject defined and argued about since the beginning. What is definitive about beauty is that it's subjective to some, objective to others, or both. What we know about architecture is that the early architects set precedents from which we build today. The pediment is related to the gable, the cornice to the crown, the flute to the reveal, the arch to Palladio's window, the classical column to the pilotis, the dome to the stadium, the flying buttress to the steel frame, the stair to the skyscraper, and the list goes on and on. The past is the foundation of the present, and to know both, whether or not you believe either beautiful, is to know the truth and thus to make the experience more meaningful. All the world's a stage, and the architect is an integral part, and buildings serve as more than just habitable sculpture. They inspire. What follows is a little history, a loose educational framework, the fabric of which should help clarify why buildings look like they do, or at the very least, where some of their traits came from. The main focus of this exploration includes architecture of antiquity, but mostly of the Western world from the last few centuries. The buildings and building elements discussed henceforth were chosen because they are either foundational to the history of architecture or considered exceptional in some way, perhaps even groundbreaking. In the beginning, humans carved away stone for shelter. Eventually, they built, and some of their structures were created for spiritual purposes. Around the 26th century BC, 3 pyramids at Giza in Egypt were built as a sacred burial place for 3 pharaohs. The pyramids were made from 2.5 tons of limestone block. In about the same period, Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England was constructed. It's not as grand as the pyramids, but it was a harbinger of one of the most influential building advances known to man, called Trabeation, or post and lintel construction. In the beginning, these structures were as crude as one stone supporting another. But eventually, civilizations like those of ancient India or Egypt created freestanding columns with beams. This construction configuration was about to change the world. About 2,000 years after the pyramids were built in Egypt, the Greeks were constructing temples on a large outcropping in Athens we now call the Acropolis. One of those buildings was the Parthenon, and inside stood a 40-foot-tall sculpture of the goddess Athena. Although the Parthenon isn't the first structure of its kind, it could be viewed as a kind of historical architectural amalgam, and thus, for discussion's sake, a symbolic beginning to form and detail in architecture. The structure clearly employs Trabeation in its signature arrangement of column and beam. An idea copied infinitely throughout history, Trabeation is a readily applied means to not only hold things up, but to create openings in walls for light, air, passage, and views. The triangular pediment of the Parthenon is a harbinger of the ubiquitous gable roof. The entablature and pediment feature details that will later become synonymous with moldings like the crown, copied far and wide. The 5 classical Roman orders were based on the Greeks' original 3. The Roman architect Vitruvius wrote about them in the 10 books on architecture around 15 BC. They are the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. The Tuscan order was developed by the Romans and based on the Doric. It's the most uncomplicated of the 5. The Doric order is one of the 3 original Greek orders. The Greek Doric column is unique because it does not have a base, while the Roman Doric does. The Roman Doric order is slightly more decorative than the Tuscan. The Ionic column features the volute, or spiraling capital. The Corinthian column was the last of the 3 classical orders to be developed by the Greeks. The Composite order is the last of the 5 classical Roman orders. The capital is unique because it combines the volutes of the Ionic order and the acanthus leaves of the Corinthian. The classical column is ubiquitous because of its association with the buildings of antiquity. It's understood that these columns make a statement of permanence, authority, and grandeur. In the last 100 years, architects have also built on this reputation by unique variations. However, one of the first truly creative adaptations appeared right next to the Parthenon at the Porch of Maidens. The small Porch of 6 Maidens is positioned on the south side of the Erechtheum on the Acropolis. The columns are sculptures of women. The maidens could have been Ionic columns like those found around the corner on the temple. Instead, the architect Nesicles did something creative. The maidens taper as they ascend, just like a typical column. The heads appear like capitals and are just thick enough at the neck to support the weight above. And creatively, their dresses mimic Ionic fluting. From caves to Trabeation, pyramids to the Pantheon, caryatids to classical orders, humankind lived, worshipped, and buried their dead. But they also did something far more lasting. They were creative. We could have stayed in caves, built nothing else, and added not one bit of ornament to our habitable objects. But we didn't, precisely because we are creative beings. Creativity has moved architecture forward through a kind of evolution. Architects learn from one another, copy each other, and build on one another's work. And every once in a while they do something so unique it changes the paradigm. And one might venture to say that although it's not always obvious, Trabeation is the thread that makes it all possible. Architects are the creative force behind our built environment, and good ones make buildings look the way they do for a reason. In 1914, a new building could be found in downtown Grinnell, Iowa. That building had a large decorative element called a cartouche placed squarely on the front facade. The building is the work of an architect named Louis Henry Sullivan. The elements reflect Sullivan's thinking about buildings that actually originated with the Roman architect known as Vitruvius. Vitruvius believed that buildings should not only be structurally sound, but functional and beautiful. Sullivan was a Chicago architect well known for his embrace of the idea that a building's form should follow its function. In some ways, this thinking was the reason for the geometrically simplistic massing seen in many of his buildings. However, it was his familiarity with Vitruvius that seems to have inspired the organic detail that adorned his buildings and set his work apart. An organic approach to design was also fundamental to the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright worked for Adler and Sullivan for 5 years, and during that time closely with Sullivan. While Sullivan's work included organic detail, Wright took the approach further. Some of his work leaned on organic form, while other projects express a kind of organic likeness to the surroundings. We see this in his Prairie School designs. However, his most famous project to accomplish an almost complete organic synthesis is the residence he designed for the Kaufman family called Falling Water. The clients wanted the home to have a view of the waterfall on the property, but Wright decided to set the home directly on it. The building features a series of unique cantilevered porches as it cascades down and across the site. It is the epitome of a building that both responds to context and enhances a sense of place. Frank Lloyd Wright worked for Louis Sullivan, who worked for Frank Furness. Furness was a prolific architect whose buildings were idiosyncratic, to say the least. He was talented and unusual, and his buildings took the Victorian style popular at the time in a fanciful new direction. He was also clearly impressed and influenced by the Gothic revival work of the earlier century. Furness manipulates form and scale to the point that it distorts the architecture. His buildings reflect his inventive aesthetic flair. They are powerful, overgrown, and quirky in their use of common architectural elements. Everything was different, including colors, textures, and ornament. His columns, archways, roof shapes, and finials are all oversized, squeezed, stretched, accentuated, and unique. They are also organic with recognizable, however distorted, forms and design. Frank Furness was an American architect who pushed the boundaries of style. Spanish architect Antonio Gaudí, on the other hand, created his own. Like Furness, Gaudí's work was idiosyncratic. It was also his attempt to create a regional modernism inspired by the natural world of the Catalan region. His church Sagrada Familia, begun in 1882, is still under construction. The idea was to use traditional organization and elements as a framework for the fantastic. Like other churches, it has an entry, towers, colonnade, aisles, nave, and apse. However, to the contrary of the genre, it looks like a building in constant motion, grown from the earth or from another world. Its form is based on nature's botanical and geological treasures, and its shapes and details make allusions to seashells, the ocean, waves, sand, the shoreline, rolling hills, and rocky cliffs. The architect has adorned buildings with representations of the natural world from the beginning, and technology has further given us the ability to make architecture take on organic form. Frank Lloyd Wright made columns look like lily pads and a gallery look like a shell. Le Corbusier made concrete buildings that use organic form to create seemingly impossible compositions. Eero Saarinen created dynamic, expressive structures that evoke thoughts of wings or flight. Oscar Niemeyer went to the future with curvilinear structures that look less like buildings and more like something that landed there. Calatrava has taken all that came before him to soaring new levels. And Zaha Hadid's office has repeatedly been ahead of its time with energetic, curvilinear structures that always surprise. The arch first appeared in Mesopotamia, but the Romans made it famous. The arch is used to span a particular distance while providing an opening plus load-bearing capacity. Trabeated construction does the same and likely came first, but the arch does a few things better. A beam is weakest at the middle, but no point of the arch is weaker than any other. A trabeated opening can only be as wide as a single element, like a lintel. Ingeniously, the arch uses a collection of small elements to span a potentially larger space, creating ever more dramatic compositions. But this comes at a price. It takes time to build an arch, and it's expensive to build large ones. Arches come in a wide variety of shapes and have been employed throughout history to create endless variations on form and space. The Romans used the arch for aqueducts and architecture, and we use it for much the same. Whether it was H. Richardson in Boston, Eero Saarinen in St. Louis, or Calatrava in Spain. Just as architects pushed the limits of the arch, they've done so with every available material and method. It's in pushing limits that human beings find new ways of building. The tallest commercial load-bearing masonry building in the world is the Monadnock Building in Chicago, designed by Burnham and Root and completed in 1891. The building has 16 stories plus an attic. Its masonry envelope supports an iron-framed interior and is a massive 6 feet thick at the base. It was subsequently added to on its south side the same year the first portion was completed. The new structural system is consequently more advanced. It's iron and steel with a thin veneer of masonry and terracotta. Once the structural metal skeleton was developed, building limits melted away, and architects soon figured out ways to literally hang a building's envelope from the structural system located on the inside. D.H. Burnham & Company designed the Reliance Building in Chicago, completed in 1895. It's the first building of its kind to hang a thin skin made of terracotta and glass from its framework made entirely of steel. This mode of construction is called curtain wall. And since then, architects have found lots of ways to take advantage of this groundbreaking construction method. Based on how much architecture has changed since then, one could argue that the Reliance Building was one of the most influential pieces of architecture in the 19th century. Along with the elevator, curtain walls and steel frames are the reason tall buildings exist. In fact, since the beginning of time, steel is the most conspicuous reason architects enjoy the kind of freedom they so thoroughly embrace today. But architects have always been inventive. Medieval designers employed a structural strategy to get more light into the sanctuary of a cathedral. They created the flying buttress. Hundreds of years later, Fay Jones designed a skeletal system of his own that accomplished the same and more. Oscar Niemeyer used huge sections of unlikely concrete as skeletal framework for a cathedral. Buckminster Fuller popularized the geodesic dome. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill used bundled tubes to climb toward the sky. And Frank Gehry invented structural systems only computers could facilitate. Even Frank Lloyd Wright pushed the limits with his falling water. However, it was also Wright who insisted that a minimal amount of reinforcing be used in the cantilevered structural system, which in turn almost collapsed. Inventive structural systems are the linchpin of many great buildings, but there'd be no need for advanced systems without imagination. Architects are creative, and that's why buildings don't all look the same. The 20th century has been especially innovative, and it all began, in many ways, with the modern movement. The term refers to a new direction in arts and architecture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was then that artists and architects found a unique voice in reaction to the Industrial Revolution by questioning traditional ways of thinking, making, and living. The modern movement marked the dawn of radical change and a search by artisans for a new aesthetic, one free of the past with roots in simplicity. Buildings were undressed, distilled, and abstracted. In fact, abstraction is at the core of the modern movement. An abstraction is the essence of something, a simplified representation. To abstract is to subjectively transform by stripping away the superfluous. Abstract painters like Picasso, Matisse, Klee, Kandinsky, and Boccioni took real subjects and ideas and simplified them to their most basic elements. With modernism, painters simplified their subject matter, and architects made building elements more primitive. That is, they left the bare bones essentials. Modernists stripped ornament from their work, and therefore the meaning associated with it. Interestingly, about 100 years before the modern movement took hold, an architect named Etienne Louis Boulet began to see architecture like no one before him. He used symmetry and classicism as an anchor, but dreamed of a new kind of architecture on a massive, austere scale, one that was traditional, however minimal, and moving toward the abstract. By the beginning of the 20th century, abstraction was to emerge with power in Germany, with examples like Peter Behrens' AEG turbine factory, Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer's shoe factory, and the Glass Pavilion by Bruno Taut. And in France, Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier was perfecting the modern style. His Villa Savoie, completed in 1931, is a notable example of abstraction. His columns became simple, undecorated, functional elements that held up the building. They were called pilotis. Stairs were replaced with ramps, and individual windows became strips of glass called ribbon windows. Adolf Loos distilled his buildings down to unornamented geometric shapes. Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus, a school for modernism in Germany. His work, including the building in Dessau, finished in 1926, was stripped down and bare, concrete, and massive areas of glass. As the modern movement evolved, architects continued to use abstraction as an effective tool. Frank Lloyd Wright, who criticized the austerity of the modern movement, found himself on the same team, though he'd been hard-pressed to admit it. His white stucco Guggenheim Museum is a collage of abstract form, austere circles, rectangles, curves, and spirals. Frank Wallace, a futurist, created the Learning Resource Center at Oral Roberts University in 1965. Its facade appears to be an abstraction of the Parthenon colonnade. Edward Durrell Stone did the same with his Kennedy Center in 1971. Robert Venturi was one of the first to create a completely new abstract language with architectural postmodernism. And today's architects like Frank Gehry take architectural abstraction to new heights with buildings that don't even look like buildings. In 1854, a man stood on a platform in New York's Crystal Palace built for the Great Exhibition. He ordered a suspending rope cut to a platform upon which he stood. But to everyone's amazement, the platform remained suspended. The man's name was Elisha Otis. And although the elevator wasn't new, the safety feature was. It was an innovation built to save lives, not just cargo, and it changed the world forever. So while the advent of abstraction and a new aesthetic paradigm was a force for change in the 20th century, innovation has always been a part of architecture. From the stone temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt to the concrete dome of the Pantheon or the structural Roman arch. In simple yet profound ways, these innovations set the course of building forever. Even the seemingly banal shape of the Colosseum was innovative for its time. Derived from the Greek semicircular amphitheater, this new structure completely surrounded its object, making any activity visible from all points. The flying buttress was first used at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The innovation reduced the size of massive stone walls, which allowed more light to flood a cathedral's interior. Hundreds of years later, Antonio Sant'Elia was imagining his own secular cathedrals of the future and inspiring future architects like John Lautner or Caesar Pelli. Le Corbusier rethought form, and Richard Neutra organized space with steel. Charles and Ray Eames made buildings that look like paintings, and Paul Rudolph used concrete in demonstrative new ways. Mies van der Rohe took architecture to a delicate new beginning, and Philip Johnson's work resembled the cumulative innovation of a time. Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano turned a building inside out in Paris, and Jean Nouvel's creations remain modern-day mechanical marvels. Calatrava makes buildings look like they're about to come alive, and Zaha Hadid makes buildings that look like they already have. Architecture has come a long way in a few thousand years, and with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution came a seismic shift in technology and thought. And with these changes, architecture's evolution was accelerated exponentially. But in some ways, things are still the same. Buildings are man-made structures. Many stand as markers. However, most buildings provide much more. They are made of a wide variety of parts from a multitude of materials, but that stuff, to a large extent, is still of the same fabric from which it came, only more evolved. Architects and builders have learned from each other since the beginning of time. Bits and pieces, materials and methods, ideas and inspiration are used, recycled, and magnified by architects to make them their own. But in the end, everything starts with a beginning, and that's where one must go to understand architecture today. The Earth moves, whether it's because of temperature or seismic conditions, and for that reason buildings need foundations. As buildings evolved, so did the platforms that allowed them to stay standing. And as the builder found ways below ground to make structures more permanent, they found ways above to create meaningful shapes that fit their needs. Building plans follow patterns. Early buildings are square, rectangular, or circular for a reason. The shapes are easy to build, the forms are functional, and the means and methods just work. In time, curiosity and wonder meant spiritual expression. Population, need, and power eventually meant government. And with wealth grew leisure. And with all of these facets of life evolved our early architectural templates, some of which still serve as patterns and blueprints for architecture today. Walls divide. They also hold things up, particularly the roof. Walls protect. In the case of humankind, they are indispensable. Early buildings used clay, mud, stone, hides, and even ice for walls. And these walls became a backdrop of intention. They were used to tell stories, intimidate, make statements, or to magnify the presence of their makers. And we do the same today. Even in the same ways, stacking bricks, stone, or wood, we weave these materials with early methods and patterns in mind. But we also do these things in more sophisticated ways. Today, walls are composed of a wide variety of materials beyond those of the early builders. These structures provide insulation, comfortable environments, and conditions where buildings can become more expressive than ever before. But it's important to remember, in the end, a wall is a wall, as it's always been, regardless of its material. Pitched or sloped roofs are ancient. The first were likely made of thatch. They were pitched to drain water and thick to provide insulation. In contrast, the flat roof is historically an arid climate phenomenon, where rain and subsequent drainage is less an issue. From the Parthenon to 550 Madison Avenue, the gable roof is ubiquitous. Variations are the hipped roof, seen on buildings like Palladian villas, or the simple cottage home. On this roof, all four sides are pitched toward a central point, like a pyramid. The mansard roof became popular in France and is commonly seen in the Victorian era. And the gambrel roof, with four planes and two distinct pitches, is likely to be seen on barns across America. Modern architecture, more often than not, features flat roofs for their simplicity, while traditional architecture is associated with pitched roofs of centuries gone by. The Romans used openings in a roof as a way to keep a building cool and provide light. They did so with an oculus at the Pantheon in Rome, which also made the roof lighter and more structurally sound. Architects and builders have taken this idea further throughout history with roof objects like the dormer. A dormer adds functional space below the roof or provides ventilation to a space that needs it. In the case of a dormer, the roof is lifted and a window or louver is added. Dormers can utilize simple gable or shed roofs or become more decorative, as is the case with the eyebrow dormer. The cupola is a structure that sits on top of a roof or dome. Its purpose is also to add light or ventilation to a space. A cupola can also be made to accommodate a bell. This structure is known as a belfry. Or it can accommodate a light fixture, in which case the structure is called a lantern. Finally, it can be made large enough to be occupied in order for the user to enjoy the weather or a view. These structures are known as belvederes. So how do people get to the roof? Before the elevator, stairs and structural systems were large considerations in building height. And up until the mid-19th century and the advent of the safety elevator, people literally climbed to the top of buildings. The dichotomy the stair presents is that while it makes buildings more than one story possible, it also limits their height. So, to access the lofty spaces created by designers, stairs come in lots of shapes and sizes. They can be straight run, winding, switchback, curved, and spiral. And today, the stair still serves as an architectural element, a point of interest, and an alternative means of egress when the power goes out. The most important thing about a stair is that it's comfortable to use. That is, the length of the tread, together with the height of the riser, must accommodate an average person's gait. Stairs are just an extension of the floor, which in turn is really just an extension of the earth. What makes the floor unique is that it's separated from the earth for obvious reasons. Buildings literally start to rot the second they're exposed to the earth and its elements. Floors are lifted off the ground to keep occupants warm and dry. This simple gesture preserves the structural system and floor materials. Wood of all sorts has always been an efficient choice for both, especially for walking surfaces. Wood is soft and rugged. Historically, hand-laid stone, brick, then tile likely came next. Rugs and carpets of various sizes and types have always been in the mix as well. And today we use all the same materials, plus man-made composites. Ironically, many of these manufactured materials are made to look just like the real thing. The goal, however, is inevitably the same as it's always been: warmth, beauty, comfort, and durability, if you can afford it. One of the most durable architectural materials is masonry, and one of the most enduring configurations is the arch. The arch had been around a while, but the Romans made it famous and took the form to a new level. There are a wide variety of different arch shapes created and adapted over time in various ways. The barrel vault, groin vault, and rose window are also kinds of arches. But the most impressive arch could be said to be the dome. One particularly striking example is the dome at Hagia Sophia in Turkey, built in the 6th century. Not only is this dome massive, but it utilizes a structural form called the pendentive. This allows the dome to sit above a square space. Today, architects continue to push the arch in various directions with new materials and methods, all of which seem to inspire the next generation to even more inventive iterations. But sometimes the most profound ideas are simple. The covered porch entrance or walkway, also called the portico, was an important innovation not only for the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, but for humankind. It is a building form that not only caught on, but has been repeated and developed extensively, particularly in monumental architecture. A portico gives a building character. It also provides a sense of arrival and protection from the elements. The Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, Italy in 126 AD. It had a portico. Hundreds of years later, Andrea Palladio used the portico broadly. Neoclassical architecture, like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, depends on the form as a reference to the past. And we still see remnants of the portico distilled down to simple roof forms and piers in modern architecture and the contemporary work of today. The portico is important, but its classical details are even more intriguing. These intricacies are derivatives of the straight line and essentially 4 shapes: the cavetto, ovolo, cyma, and ogee. The cavetto is a concave shape, the ovolo is convex, the cyma, or cyma recta, is convex at the base and concave above, and the ogee, or cyma reversa, is the opposite, or concave below and convex above. These forms are the foundation of classical building elements, the shapes of which, or iterations thereof, were employed in various parts of the 5 classical orders of architecture. Today, these shapes continue to appear on traditional architectural elements of all kinds, like the crown, casing, chair rail, panel mold, and base cap, just to name a few. Details are an integral part of architecture. They enhance buildings and conceal flaws. The door is similar in some respect. It's much like a facial expression or handshake, while it also creates necessary barriers. The size, material, color, and age indicate a lot about spaces unseen. Doors can be opaque, transparent, or somewhere in between. They can also allow the passage of a human or provide a way to conceal something inanimate. Doors can be paired, slide, or rotate. Doors can have panels or incorporate glazing. Doors have stiles, rails, and mullions. Doors also need to be operable, and for this reason have hinges of many types. They also have handles, knobs, or pulls. Windows can also be attached to doors at the top, as in a transom, or at the side, as in a side light. When a door isn't a door, it's probably a window. Windows allow light to enter a building while providing a barrier from the elements. The first glass windows were likely seen at least 2 millennia ago with the Romans. It wasn't until the mid-12th century that stained glass windows were added to cathedrals in Europe. Window construction hasn't changed all that much. In days gone by, metal mutton bars held single panes of glass. Today we do the same and use metal, wood, and composites, built-up panes of glass, plus coatings and gas to provide UV protection and insulation. The window has, simply stated, grown over time as well. The innovation in windows is due in part to the development of float glass in the 1950s, which is more uniform and flat than its predecessors. It's also due to the fact that glazing systems can be hung from a building's structural components. Building components add up, and architects have always carefully considered their assembly. One historically critical idea for architects is symmetry. Symmetry is found in nature, and the most obvious examples are you and I. While we know that most humans vary slightly from side to side, most of us appear symmetrical. Symmetry means that corresponding parts exist at opposite sides of an axis. Symmetry has been used for thousands of years. It's also a telltale sign that something has been thoughtfully considered. We find unyielding symmetry in buildings like the pyramids in Egypt to the many soaring cathedrals of the world, from the Taj Mahal to the temples of Asia or ancient Greece and Rome. It follows then that we find symmetry in the work of some of the great modern architects, like Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Louis Kahn, Philip Johnson, Eero Saarinen, and more recently, Calatrava. While our brains appear symmetrical, the functions of each hemisphere are different. In this way, our minds, like many buildings, are asymmetrical. In architecture, the word asymmetrical describes a building that is dissimilar at either sides of a central axis. While symmetry was an important aspect of buildings hundreds to thousands of years ago, asymmetry slowly became more familiar. The modern movement in architecture ushered in a new era of style and form, one marked by asymmetry. And today, asymmetrical buildings are quite common. Order may be found within any type of organizational system. It's defined by both how something appears and how it functions. With this in mind, most architects have historically worked towards spaces that function and buildings that do what their clients ask. That is, regardless of whether they are symmetrical or asymmetrical. Architects use the word scale to describe proportional relationships. The proportion of a building to its user is referred to as its scale. The scale of a building can make a statement. The Greeks did so at the Acropolis in Athens. The Romans did the same with the Colosseum. Gothic and Renaissance architects achieved a similar impression with their cathedrals and palaces. The modern architect Jean Nouvel used a massive curtain wall in the ambiguously scaled elevations of the Arab World Institute in Paris. Herzog et de Meuron designed a stadium in Beijing that resembles a massive bird's nest, the elements of which dwarf the visitor. Richard Upjohn was well known for comfortably scaled Gothic revival work of the 19th century. And interestingly, it's said that Frank Lloyd Wright's supposedly diminutive stature was the model for proportion in many of his humanly scaled buildings like Falling Water. Louis Sullivan made the phrase "form follows function" famous. Sullivan believed that function should determine a building's form. In other words, function comes first. Soon after, modern architects adopted this idea, along with a revolutionary simplified aesthetic. They did so with hopes of a new clarity in form and function. The phrase form follows function established a fundamental principle of design. For example, Le Corbusier called his villa in Poissy a machine for living. The first floor was actually designed to match the turning radius of the automobile. In the mid-1900s, Mies van der Rohe created stripped-down, austere steel and glass architecture that he believed fit this ideology as well. Today, the concept, while not used in association with the modern movement, is a common design strategy. After all, it makes logical sense for most clients that function comes first. Form follows function was a well-established idea by the early 20th century. The contemporary notion that the opposite, or function follows form, would have seemed absurd at the time. However, this is the direction some architects turn today. In other words, function is secondary to building form. And why not? Today, businesses come and go, buildings change hands, and function is thus as fluid as form can be. Architects now enjoy a design freedom abetted by technological feats that were unimaginable just 100 years ago. The work of architects like Koop Himmelblau, Frank Gehry, or Zaha Hadid embodies this new ethos. Not that their buildings lack function, the idea is simply that each building's overall form is considered most critical. It could be argued that buildings have been making aesthetic statements since the beginning of time. However, those statements have become ubiquitous, leaving much more room for contemporary architecture to stand out. Architecture is more conspicuous than ever. Led by technology and the embrace of unique aesthetic sensibilities, some buildings remind us of pure sculpture. Interestingly, the Romanian artist Brancusi called architecture habitable sculpture. In the modern world, the word sculpture implies a kind of dynamic uniqueness. A building becomes something of a unique object by virtue of creativity in light of specific functional requirements. And while a building may or may not be unique aesthetically, it may be unique as an object created for a special purpose. It's not so far-fetched to say that architecture can be a kind of invention. That's because good design embodies the same qualities successful inventions do: utility, whether aesthetic or functional. Inventors solve problems with new products, and architects solve programmatic challenges with design. Most architects take style into consideration as part of the design process. That is not to say that every building can be associated with a particular style. Architects have widely varying opinions on style, and some hold those opinions with more vehemence than others. What can be agreed upon among architects is that style has meaning. Some styles developed in order to create a relationship with great societies or past civilizations, like ancient Egypt, Greece, or Rome. Other styles have their beginning in philosophical or social eras, like the Renaissance, Baroque, or Victorian. And some were created as part of an architectural school or movement tied to theoretical ideals like the Bauhaus or deconstructivism. The enjoyable aspect of architectural style is that it seems alive. That is, style not only echoes but evolves into something ever more interesting. Styles have rules. These rules are based on philosophy, opinion, or precedent. The Romans believed that the necessity for order dictated proportion. The architects of the Renaissance related their architecture to the adoration of the human mind and body. The architects of the Baroque and Rococo periods designed buildings that were extravagantly ornate. Neoclassical architects returned to the roots of Greece and Rome. Arts and crafts architecture accentuated how things were made. Modernists eliminated ornament altogether. However, at the turn of the 21st century, we see fewer rules followed and more that are simply broken. Architecture continues to reach back to the past as it forcefully stretches beyond itself. And the only thing holding it back at this point seems to be gravity, and even that is in question. As architecture has grown more aesthetically bold, it's gotten taller too. Humankind has been fascinated with tall buildings since the beginning. A story in the book of Genesis describes people coming together to build a structure that reached God. From the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the record-setting skyscrapers of today, people want to climb higher. As far back as the Middle Ages, Italian families competed to have the tallest towers in the city. Almost 1,000 years later in Chicago, iron, then steel, made tall buildings ever taller. In 1922, an international competition was held by the Chicago Tribune. The competition drew entries from famous architects and marked a renaissance in tall buildings. The Tribune Tower, designed by John Mead Howells and Raymond Hood, was the winning entry and a kind of linchpin for architects in the historical race toward the heavens. In 1913, in New York City, the tallest building in the world was the Woolworth Building, coined the Cathedral of Commerce. Soon, it was eclipsed by the Chrysler Building, then the Empire State. But as buildings grew taller, the earth grew darker. In 1916, New York City created zoning laws for these tall buildings. These meant that skyscrapers should step back incrementally as they rise. In 1958, Mies van der Rohe changed the game. He was the first to step his entire Seagram building tower back, creating a large public space in front. As time passed, more interesting designs would follow. The John Hancock Tower was unique for its exoskeletal design. In 1972, the North Tower of the World Trade Center became the tallest building in the world. Then, the Petronas Towers followed. Eventually, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai took over, a design which borrows the bundled tube structural system from the Sears Tower, opened 37 years earlier. Tall buildings are exceptional, but so are many other masterworks built on a grand scale. The Château de Chambord of the French Renaissance has a moat and massive drum-like towers. Windsor Castle occupies 13 acres in Berkshire, England. The Palace of Versailles was a hunting lodge expanded by King Louis XIV. St. Basil's Cathedral illuminates Moscow's Red Square. Dunrobin Castle in Scotland originates from the 15th century. Neuschwanstein Castle is a familiar sight to tourists of southwest Bavaria. George Washington Vanderbilt II commissioned the Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina. And the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island is a summer cottage built for his brother Cornelius. Sir Edwin Lutyens rounds out the mix, considered one of England's greatest architects. His projects were monumental, bucolic, and evocative of the great estates. Monuments commemorate or memorialize. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris, France, was completed in 1836 to commemorate Napoleon Bonaparte's victory over Austria and Russia at Austerlitz. The structure is evocative of numerous Roman triumphal arches. The building makes an association, albeit one that's over a millennia old. But its meaning wasn't lost on France, and the building represents a lot about what architects and buildings do. They solve problems through association. The Burj Khalifa's size and form project power and presence while providing Dubai with an in-demand destination. On the other end of the spectrum, Disney's Cinderella Castle uses forced perspective and dreamlike aesthetics to create the illusion of monumentality. Both buildings associate with familiar forms to solve a problem. Humans solve problems, and we've done so since the beginning of time. We do this with our minds, then our bodies. It's in this doing that ideas come. If this weren't the case, the world would look as it did thousands of years ago. But it doesn't, and thus there is sufficient reason to believe that we have had a profound effect on this earth in a very short time. An impact that's been conceived in the mind and brought about through physical labor. We make buildings, and building has evolved. Whether the challenge has been to stay warm and dry, create a space for doing or being, enhance a particular place, or make a statement, humankind has created spaces for them all. And it was, without a doubt, something that likely started with one move: Trabeation. a beam set upon a post, then a rafter set upon a wall set upon a foundation set upon a rock. The ancients set timeless precedents, and architects borrow from the past to make meaningful associations. They also innovate. Parts, forms, and innovations make architecture. And thus, architectural styles have survived, died, thrived, and evolved. Buildings have meaning by virtue of form, material, and configuration. And when a structure enriches its environment or the lives of those it touches, it's likely copied. Buildings have meaning by virtue of their parts, whether it's a gable roof or flat, a classical column or a pilotis, a Roman arch or a Gothic vault, or even something new that reminds us of something else. Meaning for each of us is relative. However, it's also eternally enriched by what we know. The more we know about the past, the better we understand the present. And ultimately, the better we know why buildings look like they do.